Hello, my name is Andrew, and I'm here today to tell you a bit about the pluralistic approach to counselling and how we use British Sign Language interpreters as part of the therapy process. Yvonne is here to help me communicate better with people who use British Sign Language as a preferred method of communication. Okay, so deaf clients come to therapy for broadly the same reasons as everyone else. Although they are reported to have a higher instance of mental health issues, such as depression, anxiety, and substance misuse. But what's also reported is that they have difficulty accessing healthcare systems and are poorly understood by healthcare providers, and therefore they may be less likely to seek professional support. And again, once they do access services, their experiences are often associated with strong negative emotions, such as anger, frustration, simply because BSL interpreters might not be available to meet the communication needs of both the healthcare provider and the client. So deaf people are therefore often forced to communicate in ways that cause poor miscommunication, misdiagnosis, and poor treatment. Indeed, as therapists ourselves, it's also been reported that we lack awareness of our own negative attitudes towards deaf people. And as pluralistic practitioners, we accept we're vulnerable to prejudice, recognise the importance of self-inquiry, personal feedback, and professional development, and we endeavour to demonstrate equality, diversity, and ensure inclusion for all clients. One of the key foundational principles of pluralistic practice is the ethical principle of care. And pluralism is based on a pluralistic approach to counselling, is based on a philosophical approach of pluralism, which basically suggests that a variety of beliefs, values, and realities exist, all of which are valid. In other words, all sources of knowledge are equally valid, and there is no universal truth. And as such, we embrace cultural diversity, and we collaborate with clients in respectful and sensitive ways and position them at the centre of the therapy process. So I'll tell you a bit about what counselling is, first of all. So counselling is what happens when a person consults someone else around a problem of living, a conflict or dilemma that is getting in the way, or that is preventing people from living their lives in the way in which they would wish. Counsellors themselves are trained listening professionals who work to professional codes of practice. And for example, I'm a member of the British Association of Counsellors and Psychotherapists and work to their professional and ethical standards. We also know that on average, therapy is generally a positive effect on people's mental health and well-being. And as you may know, there are a huge variety of different types of approaches to counselling, some of which you may have heard of. For example, cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT, perhaps psychodynamic, perhaps family systems therapy, or person-centred therapy. But what we do know from research is that broadly all therapies have the same outcomes, all are equally as effective. In particular, deaf clients themselves expressed a preference for treatments which were indeed highly flexible. And the pluralistic approach is an integrative approach. That means it doesn't identify with any one psychological model, but it embraces methods and techniques from different theoretical approaches. It's a collaborative perspective, so really it's a process of working together to create a shared understanding of what's happening. And it's deeply rooted in the humanistic tradition. In other words, it puts clients at the centre of therapy. It also believes that clients themselves have their own self-healing capacities and probably are just stuck in a position in life which they need help to move on from. We know that clients come with clear ideas of what they need and want from therapy and act with intention towards some desired future state which is meaningful to them. We also believe that there are different things that are likely to help people at different points in time, and the best way for therapy to proceed is through a process of collaboration and shared decision-making. What that means, for example, in one therapy session, a client may want to focus on emotions, and another session may want a more structured approach. And again, therapy is very much tailored to the individual person. We believe that collaborative conversation and dialogue creates this shared understanding between therapists and clients about what clients actually want from therapy, in other words, their goals, what needs to be done to achieve them, tasks, and how these tasks will then be approached, and that would be the methods for each. And we also believe that involving clients in the decision-making process throughout therapy allows clients the freedom to direct their own lives, determine their own care, and provide them with preferred services. So I want to introduce to Paula. Paula's a fictional character. I'll tell you a bit about her. So this is Paula. She's come to therapy with her anxiety problem. She's a bit worried about what's going on in her life. She's maybe drinking a bit too much to cope. She tells me she had a bad childhood, very unhappy childhood, didn't form good relationships. And over the last few years, her mum has died, and she tells me she's not properly grieved for her mum. About the same time, her relationship broke up, which is very distressing for her. And again, her drinking increased. But she now finds she's having trouble making friends and having problems at work. So this is Paula. So in order to make sense of all that and to create a shared understanding, pluralistic therapists try to draw these strands of shared decision-making together and create a timeline for a client. And that would be a visual representation of what the client has told us and what the client has agreed. And that's something we work on together in therapy. And it's used in each therapy session. It's added to as therapy tasks and goals are achieved. And research suggests that these, as visual assessment tools, these are quite popular with deaf clients. And we also know they help to identify what happens in therapy. In reality, this is what one might look like. Again, it's just a made-up example. But the typed elements, again, that would be handwritten by the therapist and all the input from clients. But what you can see is, as we're talking through Paula's life, there's maybe connections being made between her childhood, her drinking, her anxiety, maybe to do with her mum's death and her drinking and also her anxiety. And again, it's allowing us to get a shared understanding of what's important to Paula, what does she want to bring to therapy, what goals has she got, and maybe some idea of how we could approach each of those goals. So a typical example of a goal for Paula could be, I want to feel less anxious and more confident in social situations. We might ask a scaling question, so we might not be clear on what her anxiety feels like for her, but what we can ask is maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, how anxious are you feeling just now? And perhaps even in the therapy room, as she's come to therapy, we might ask her, how are you feeling just now on a scale of 1 to 10? She might tell us it's 8. So again, that gives us a clear example of when therapy starts. She's maybe feeling really anxious. And what Paula will be hopeful of as therapy progresses is that that scaling question might come down to a 5 or a 6 or a 4, again, to give some idea that therapy has actually worked for her. Another goal, for example, Paula may want to use, although there are a number, as you've probably seen, could be, I want to reduce my alcohol consumption. She may be drinking a bottle of wine every couple of days. And again, she might recognise that's maybe too much for her. And she wants to find out ways to reduce that from maybe 1 bottle down to half a bottle or no bottles at all. So once we've identified the goals, pluralistic therapists use goal forums, and that allows clients to write down in their own words what they're trying to achieve in therapy. It also therefore allows them to review them and track their progress towards on a regular basis in collaboration with the therapist. But we also know that therapies which rely on written materials, not everybody likes them. And, because English and British Sign Language are different languages, a lot of deaf clients may not want to use forums. They may find them not useful, or they may want to represent their goals in different, more visual ways. Again, pluralistic therapists would work with clients to maybe suggest or get some ideas from clients about how best their goals could be represented. So the tasks are the things we need to do in order to achieve the goals. And there's a variety of tasks which could be included, from behaviour change to maybe talking through an issue to make sense of it. But for Paula, her goal of wanting to feel less anxious and more confident in social situations, it might be talking through the experience of anxiety to try and make sense of it. It might be exploring specific examples of when anxiety might be particularly challenging for her. So, for example, she might feel anxious going into lunch breaks with colleagues at work, or maybe in large groups she feels anxious about. Just trying to get some sense of where her anxiety or social anxiety is coming from. It might also be appropriate to identify some exceptions to those rules, where perhaps there are situations where Paula doesn't feel anxious within social groups. So maybe to identify, what's different there? How can we maybe try and move those things forward into other social settings? In terms of her mum's death, it might be something she might recognise, in fact, that following her mum's death, she became more anxious and she started to drink more. And talking about her mum's death might be helpful for her. Again, that might be the same to do with her marriage breakup. Paula may want to go back to her childhood and maybe think that things that happened in her childhood were important for her, and that's where really her anxiety started. So again, she might want to explore her childhood and then get some understanding and sense of what's going on for her in her life and create some acceptance that she's not that person anymore. Again, a lot of deaf clients have faced discrimination and prejudice in their life. So again, it might involve a discussion around wider issues of social justice. So for example, it could be maybe a client at work, maybe they're feeling colleagues aren't talking to them, or maybe thinking they're silly or stupid or whatever. And again, those issues could be impacting on your individual anxiety levels. And again, that's something a client might want to talk about. But another key thing clients might want to do is basically to learn coping strategies. How am I going to deal with this anxiety when it comes up? Are there any things I could learn from the therapist? So in terms of how we approach these, there's a variety of number of methods from different approaches we could use. So for Paula, again, these are the tasks, I've just copied them through for you. So some of the methods, it might just be, a therapist listening carefully to what's been said, reflecting back in an empathic, non-judgmental way about what's happening. And for Paula to try and make some sense of what's happening in her life. Again, she may think some of these negative thoughts she's having, that, I've nothing useful to say, or I'm going to sound stupid if I speak. Perhaps it could involve identifying some of those negative thought processes and working with them in therapy. Could perhaps be teaching diaphragmatic breathing, mindfulness techniques, maybe some grounding techniques, so that Paula's in a social situation where she's feeling anxious. She could use some of those techniques to help her calm down. Or it could be using her own cultural resources. So for example, when we looked at Paula's timeline, you may have noticed some of her own resources were there. She did yoga before. She went to some other exercise classes. So again, it might involve Paula maybe thinking about re-engaging in some of those other activities to bring her out and to again re-engage her with some social activity. But there are a huge number of creative ideas which pluralistic therapists were able to recommend. And these could include drawing and painting within sessions. It could be using photography, hope collages, maybe perhaps working outside the therapy room, and a whole number of other methods which pluralistic therapists would collaborate on with clients as they approach the therapeutic work. One important aspect of pluralistic practice is to make sure you get regular feedback from clients about whether therapy is on track, or if it isn't, to try and bring it back to where the client wants it to go. Within a session, for example, we use a particular method of communication to really check out with clients at various points. Are things okay? Are you quite happy with what's happening in the session? It could also be, for example, I might notice that you look a bit angry or annoyed or frustrated about what's being discussed. And again, I might notice that with you. What's going on right now for you? What are you feeling? It could also be at the end of a session where they ask you, what have you found helpful today? Has there been anything of particular help during the session? Or perhaps even something that's been unhelpful? Again, we try and keep in regular touch in the session, just through checking out at regular moments what's actually going on right now. We also use a number of feedback forums, which therapists would use at a regular basis, again, for a variety of reasons, to check out how your psychological well-being is, maybe at the start, maybe in a third session or sixth session. And it'd be also to check out how the relationship's working between the client and the therapist himself. Again, pluralistic therapists would discuss those with you within each session. And again, in terms of the forms themselves, we would always seek your preference about whether you would want to complete the forms yourself, or whether the therapist would vocalise the content through the interpreter. Or again, we could find some visual ways of working, or perhaps just work with the ideas that you might bring to therapy about how those tasks and things could be achieved. So I'd like to tell you a bit about how we work with British Sign Language interpreters like Yvonne. And while most hearing therapists are unlikely to be fluent in British Sign Language, and we do lack awareness of deaf culture, it's very likely we will use British Sign Language interpreters as part of the therapy process. We know that some clients may not want to use BSL interpreters. They may use sensible English, or prefer to use other methods of communication. We'll always check out your preferences about which way you would prefer. All our therapists are hold recognised qualifications. They're trained listening professionals, they work to their own standards. An ability to use sign language doesn't necessarily qualify someone to be an interpreter in a counselling session. So, for example, we wouldn't use friends or family. We recognise that confidentiality is really important for you because deaf communities are small and close-knit. And we want to make sure therapy is as safe as possible for you. If we have to change appointments or communicate with you at all, we'll do that via your preferred method of communication. And that could perhaps involve a hearing friend or relative. Again, we'd always seek your consent before we contact them to try to avoid any confidentiality breaches. So again, just making sure you're as safe as possible within the therapy room. In terms of selecting interpreters, pluralistic practitioners would try to involve you collaboratively in the process of selecting one before therapeutic work starts. You may have a preference for one you've used before that you could perhaps use again. You may have a preference for a gender-specific interpreter. So, for example, as a male therapist, and you were a female client, for example, if Paula was coming, she may feel intimidated by two men being in the room, and she may have a preference for a female interpreter. But good practice would suggest we keep the same interpreter throughout the therapy process if that's possible. However, the fact that we'll employ qualified therapists, it doesn't necessarily guarantee the quality of the services they provide. So you might find that during sessions you've got concerns about what you're telling us isn't being interpreted properly. You may feel that the interpreter is not signing correctly or signing too slowly or quickly. And again, those concerns you would voice with us and let us know about that. We can then agree the best way forward. And that could involve perhaps talking about that within a session directly, or perhaps talking to the interpreter directly. But again, the worst case scenario, we would have to recontract with another BSL interpreter. And I know from personal experience that the change of interpreter with one client made a huge difference to the quality of the relationship itself and also what was disclosed in therapy and helped to achieve the final outcome. So before therapy starts, we do brief interpreters before you come into the room. And it's nothing to do with telling them about your name or your address. It's all kept confidential. But we might give them an idea about what we expect from them in therapy. We might also give an opportunity for them to express any concerns or anxieties they might have. Or we may give some background information about you. So, for example, if you were coming about a drinking problem, or perhaps you had maybe it was recognised in the referral form you had some maybe suicidal ideation, it might be helpful for interpreters to know about that before we actually begin the session to prepare them almost for what might come up. So during the session, we'll try to keep jargon to a minimum. We know this can be difficult to translate in British Sign Language. Can I just apologise for the phone ringing in the background if that's there at all? And we'll regularly check out with you at the end of the session to ensure therapy is on track, whether it's been helpful or not. And we may also check out with you about any sense of tension we feel that might have happened in the room. So, for example, we feel there may be a sense of tension between yourself and the interpreter, or in fact between yourself and the interpreter. We may bring that out into the open within the session. After each session, good practice also recommends that we debrief interpreters, maybe offering them 10 minutes afterwards. And that's really just to make sure the interpreter's own psychological well-being. For example, it might also cover whether I'm speaking too quickly or I'm using too much jargon. But really one of the main focuses is to make sure that the interpreter is psychologically safe once the session ends, because it may well be some of the things that you bring to therapy could be quite emotionally demanding for the interpreter, and it's important that we recognise that after each session. In terms of practical considerations, so when you come to therapy, you want to make sure you're as comfortable as possible, whether that would be online or in face-to-face settings. If it's a room, we want to make sure it's sufficient to accommodate 3 people. We'll collaborate together on where each person's sitting. The normal position would normally be to have the interpreter next to the therapist facing you. Again, if you want to change that, that's okay. We'll try to avoid sitting with backs to the windows, because that might involve the light affecting what's been seen and signed. If there's any problems you experience at all in the therapy room, please let us know. We want to make sure you're able to come to therapy, have a good experience, you're able to talk freely in confidence, tell us what has brought you there, and obviously for yourself to get some resolution for some of the problems that you may have brought to us in therapy. So hopefully that tells you a bit about pluralistic practice and about how we work with interpreters. If you want to find out any more, there's a number of websites and YouTube videos you can access. And there's a number of references attached to the end of this which you may find helpful. Thanks very much for listening.